All right, welcome to Traveling Dice. I'm doing a thrift store challenge today. I'm going into the thrift store and I'm hoping to find something that can inspire a terrain project or a D&D scenario or a monster or something I can turn into a miniature piece of terrain or anything along those lines. Something I can go into the thrift store and rescue. I'll let you know how we do. All right, so the thrift store was actually super busy, so I couldn't do any video in there without looking odd. But I did find this toy for $2. And I think this is gonna actually be the right scale. I'm gonna cut off the ramp, I think, but this is going to be a piece of terrain for my Gaslands games. So more to come on that project. So when I got this thing back to the house, I was actually really excited to have found something that I really felt like fit the Gaslands game so well. The first thing that I wanted to do was to take this thing apart. Now, it had like a million screws, so the thought that's going through my head as I get deeper into taking this thing apart is I'm really glad that I'm not the parent that had to put this thing together. Nevertheless, I start working at this thing, and it's got like a million screws, which I didn't notice when I first purchased. Now, I still would have gotten it, but taking it apart is quite a tedious task here. I am thinking that I'm going to use the ramp as some kind of elevated series for a D&D scenario. Still working out all the details for that. So getting that ramp off was actually oddly gratifying after several minutes of working at it. I do have the recording here on double speed, so I'm not actually quite that fast with my hands. So I get the ramp off, and I actually want to also take that top off, because what I'm thinking is I don't like that there's that hole there. So the Matchbox car is supposed to pop out that hole and go down the ramp. And initially I was kind of thinking, maybe I could use that hole, like, a missile hit the silo and blew a hole in it or something like that. But as I started to get further into the project, I really disliked that idea more and more. It seemed like it was just going to look like what it was, a hole for a Matchbox car. So I wanted to actually remove that centerpiece and make it more of a solid cylinder. And I also didn't like that railing. I didn't think that the railing really scaled well. I think in theory that's supposed to be something that as a human is walking around it, that it's preventing them from falling. But nothing could really fit between that railing and where the cylinder was. So I was thinking I would remove that. Prior to that, though, as I'm handling this toy, it's actually really flimsy and parts of it are popping off, especially the metal wiring down below, or what's supposed to be metal wiring. So I go through and I do some super gluing. Now, my super glue actually doesn't hold very well on this particular plastic, which is super frustrating. And you'll see I go through a few times here and I actually add some baking soda in with the super glue. Now, this is going to give it a rough texture in areas, which is actually okay, I think, because I'm going to go for a rusted effect at some point with my paint job. So I got that very top piece off, which was great. I wanted to definitely reuse that. I like the shape of it. I like the style of it. I just wanted to replace that actual cylinder part. And I have a few ideas for how I might do that. But what I'm checking here is I'm seeing, is the diameter of that equal to the base? Because if it isn't, I have a problem to deal with in my mind, right? I can either try to have some kind of tapering effect where the cylinder that I'm going to put there starts the same width of the base, and then gets slightly smaller up to the top. Now that seems like it's going to be probably the most difficult option. Or I can have a little bit of a gap that I'm going to fill in at the bottom, which is the route that I actually decide to go. So I end up removing the railing here, and you do want to be careful when you're using the X-Acto blade. I'm mindful here to, as much as possible, cut away from myself. Anytime that's possible when I'm making a cut, I try to do that, and I'm going slow. I'm not trying to force it too much here, although it looks like I'm going fast just because of the double speed. I'm doing this relatively slowly and just being very careful because you want to keep safety in mind when you're using an X-Acto knife. I also had this little bump out portion here, which really was just there to support the ramp. And I wanted to remove that. I thought it didn't really fit the direction I was going with this particular project. So this is probably not the best way to use my expensive GW clippers. They're not really intended for stuff that's this big, but I was kind of on a roll and they were right by me. So I didn't go for my bigger clippers that probably would be better suited for this. So I go through in some areas and I apply some super glue and add some baking soda. This is to make some areas a little bit stronger, but also to give a little bit more texture. And in these areas, I'm planning on painting on some kind of rust effect. You'll also see that the piece of terrain has all those holes where the screws were. At some point, I go through and I fill those in, and I use a combination of paper towels with PVA they're pretty deep, so I don't want to use a bunch of material, but I do that at one point. I think I do that off camera. So at some point you may notice that those are filled in, and then when I get to the outer area, I do apply a little section of super glue and some baking soda on those areas. Now at this point, I feel like I'm ready to make that cylinder. And I decide I'm going to make it out of cardboard. And I'm thinking that I'm going to try to use that corrugation kind of to my advantage and hopefully have it work for me so that it kind of has that metal barn kind of a look. Now, I don't know if silos are typically built like that. I think I generally see them smooth, but I think it's going to look better having those ridges. And I think it's going to paint up a little bit better. So I get a strip. I have it the right height that I want for the height of the cylinder. And I do kind of trim off areas to get it to be the right length so that ultimately it'll be the diameter that I want. And what I do is I'm just using that blue tape to hold it in place while that tacky glue dries. And then I do put a little strip of tacky glue on the seam on the outside and kind of rub that in. And my hope is that as it dries, it'll be hard to see that seam. Now, I can still see that seam now that the project's done. I think sometimes the person that makes the terrain kind of knows where to look for those types of things. I don't know that other people would notice it so much. And here you see that I have the base primed. I think that things were starting to adhere better. I thought the hot glue would actually hold better if the toy was primed as opposed to trying to go on that slick plastic. And I cut that center circle there and I hot glue that in. And the cylinder is completely dry and I apply the hot glue onto that cone-shaped top portion. And I'm going to put the cylinder on there and hold that in place as that hot glue sets. Now I'm checking the various sides to make sure that it's not too off on any one side. I don't want it to be hanging off and then be flush on one side and hanging off on the other. And then I felt like that connection was just at a really narrow point. So what I do on the inside here is that I go in with the glue gun and I'm just hitting that seam where the cardboard is meeting the toy with a pretty generous amount of hot glue, to be honest with you. Test fit it to make sure it's going to fit somewhat the way I want it, get a sense of how I need to place it down. I place a layer of hot glue there at the bottom of the cylinder and then try to very quickly then place it in place, apply a little bit of pressure, give it a little wiggle, make sure it's sitting the way that I want it to. And it seems to connect fairly well, and it seems to connect in a decent spot there. Now I do notice after that I have a little bit of a gap between the bottom of the cylinder and the top of what will be the metal portion there. And what I do is I go in and I fill this in with a little bit of PVA, kind of let it dry. And again, my plan there is to kind of make it look like there's some rust buildup on that ridge anyways. So having a little material there is going to be okay ultimately in how I'm planning on painting it. Now I really feel like that bottom portion there, it's solid, and I think that in actuality would be open and you would see dirt and soil. So what I do is I apply a layer of PVA glue and I'm going to then put on top of that some loose sand. And I actually want to build this up, so I actually do several layers of this. The other thing I kind of want to achieve is add some weight at the bottom, because this is going to be a tall piece of terrain. I decided not to put it on a base. I felt like it was stable enough, but having that weight at the bottom, I think will hopefully prevent it from tipping over during gameplay. And I don't think it'll tip over unless somebody bumps it, but you know how war gamers are. So I get the project completely primed and it's time to start the painting process. And what I'm going to do initially is dry brush on some folk art, metallic silver sterling. I'm going to focus on the inside portions. I do want those to be a little bit darker, but I don't think that they should be black. So I'm going to kind of meticulously work my way around. There's not actually a lot of wiggle room here. So at some point I will switch over to a smaller brush for that interior. But the nice part about these big terrain projects, I feel like I can just grab really big brushes and kind of just go to town. So I dry brush that onto the wiring base and then also the very top of the roof. So at this point I go in with a smaller brush and try to hit those areas that I had a hard time fitting in with the large brush. And I'm going to do a couple of coats on that cylinder portion. My base coat is going to be Ceramcoat Barn Red. And I'm just going to paint this directly on there. I'm not really trying to do a dry brush. I was deliberately sloppy with the earlier metallic color, knowing that I was going to paint over it. I'm also actually excited to use this edge brush. I feel like I have a bunch of them in my paintbrush collection here, and it's rarely my tool of choice, but I thought it was just perfect for this particular task. Now, as I'm waiting for that barn red to dry on the cylinder, I decide I want to go in and work on that soil that's going to be in the center at the bottom of my terrain piece. So I go in with what I would say is a medium dark brown. It's an apple barrel nutmeg brown. And I'm just applying this. I'm trying to get total coverage essentially, and I'm just applying it directly onto the center there until I feel like it looks brown. And not long after applying that base coat to the soil down at the bottom, the barn red has now dried and I'm ready to go ahead and do a highlight of cardinal red. I would kind of describe this as a medium bright red. Now I'm still planning on kind of going over this with a portion of the rust effects, even on areas of the cylinder. My thought is that as rain would be falling down on the roof, it would kind of cascade down the whole structure, which seems to make sense. So you would see rust maybe throughout the whole structure, streaks of rust because of the rain. So I just go over and doing a highlight here of that cardinal red. Not going for complete coverage here. I want to see variations in the two reds. Now, years ago, I felt like I had a really good rust recipe for painting, and I never wrote it down. And then I went years and years without painting anything rusty. And then I went to go and paint something rusty and I couldn't remember it. So it was really frustrating. So if you have tips on painting rust and you don't mind sharing those in the comments, that would be great. But I grabbed that nutmeg brown from the apple barrel, and what I'm doing is I'm kind of stippling it on in the areas where I think I'm going to have a rust effect, which is actually a lot of areas. So I'm being pretty general with this, but I'm not trying to do streaks. I'm just kind of pressing the brush into the terrain piece, and I'm not moving it. So it's just kind of punching it essentially, but with a fair amount of force. So for the orange portion of the rust effect, I am using Ceramcoat Terracotta, and it's kind of a burnt orangish kind of a color. And I do actually water this down a fair amount. So I'm going at it with a wet brush, and then I actually go and get a cup of water. And I'm trying to see if I can get it to be kind of streaky. I'll be completely honest, I'm not totally happy with the initial results of this particular rust effect as I'm going through this part. And I'm kind of gritting my teeth because it's a little bright. It's not quite what I had envisioned. It ends up kind of coming together at the end. After I let this completely dry, I end up doing my typical varnishes. And I like to do a gloss varnish spray on first. And then after the gloss varnish has dried, I like to go in and do a matte spray over that to kind of knock down that sheen. I do like that kind of double layer of protection. I think I don't really have anything to base this on scientifically, but I do think that the gloss coat seems to provide a better layer of protection. I think it's a little bit more durable. And then I also actually like the effect that it tends to have on paints. I think it kind of just blends things together as it's sitting there. And you'll have the two different paint colors that are next to each other. and I think it has a really positive effect, specifically the brand that I use for the gloss spray, which is the Testors brand. Now, you get really small cans of the Testors brand, and they're kind of expensive, but that's what I use for the gloss coat. And then for the matte coat, I usually use the Citadel one, which is also expensive. At least it comes in a bigger can. It's just definitely better than other matte sprays. I've tried the cheaper ones, and I don't think you get the same level of results. Now, I was still unhappy with the sheen of the orange after I did the gloss spray. And although I did this off camera, I hit portions with a GW wash, which was the Earthshade, Agrit's Earthshade, I believe is what it's called. And that had a nice effect. Now, it's a really rainy day here, and it was really not the best weather conditions for spraying. It was kind of borderline. I thought I could get away with it, but the other thing that kind of happens is there are some areas where the sheen is a little bit cloudy at the end, and you'll see that at the end result here. I think looking at the terrain piece, it kind of has the effect that it looks like it's just been beaten down by the sun, and at least that's what I'm going with at this point, because I don't want to repaint it. But yeah, I kind of pushed it a little bit with the weather, and it could have been worse, I guess, so I should be grateful for that. But you do need to be careful using these sprays depending upon the weather, even if you're not actually outside. I was in a garage, but still the moisture in the air can greatly affect how they dry. In case you want to see what those two clear coats look like, there they are. And here is the finished product. And I'm going to declare this a success. It's got a few areas where I wish they had turned out a little bit better, but for $2, I have an awesome piece of terrain for my Gaslands game, and I had a lot of fun building it. If you've ever gone to Goodwill or the thrift store and you found something really cool that you incorporated into your games, definitely share in the comments. I'm interested to hear about it. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please do consider liking and subscribing. I hope you enjoyed this project. Bye for now.